just like last week, and then there will be plenty of time for questions and answers. But if you have questions in between, then please also feel free to ask them at any point. I'll be sharing my slides with you that I hope you can now all see. And yeah, so these slides are really very similar to the European Job Market for Economists info session that I have delivered at the European Economic Association meeting, and they are already online, and you'll be seeing the link at the very end of this presentation. So you'll have access to these documents as well. So my name is David Schindler. I'm on the faculty at Tilburg University in the beautiful Netherlands, where the sun had briefly been shining today, but not any longer, it seems. Today is all about your job market package, what goes in it, and how to assemble the documents. So first of all, I'm splitting this up in 3 categories, what your job market package should contain. First and foremost, your job market paper. That is the most important document that goes in the package. That is the key around which the whole job market revolves. You should have your CV and then at least 3 letters of recommendation. I'll be briefly talking about the letters of recommendation as well, but anything between 3 and 5 letters of recommendation is what we see for people going on the market. Then many places make it optional to include a cover letter. I'll be saying something about the importance of the cover letter later on. And then some places may require you to send in a teaching or a research statement. And then what's optional and way less common is to include teaching evaluations or a diversity statement. That's particularly uncommon. Teaching evaluations are still quite common, or then maybe even other papers that you may have. And I'll be talking about all of these items separately. So maybe a quick remark at this stage. If you want to add another paper to your package, you always have to think carefully about whether that's worth doing it, because a not very good paper may hurt your application. So you should always, whenever you think about adding anything beyond the mandatory items, you should always ask yourself, is this strengthening my application or is it not? If it's not strengthening your application, then you should probably omit it. So the most important item is the job market paper. What is the job market paper? So essentially, the job market paper has 2 purposes, and that is to showcase your ability as an academic economist. And I've underlined and printed in bold the your, because this is really about you as a person. So it should first of all show that you're able to ask and then answer really novel and extremely interesting research questions that have implications either for the scientific discipline you're working in, or that can be used to be applied in some fields, and that's where the far-reaching implications come from. And you want to show that you answer these questions by using the most modern, the state-of-the-art techniques, and that you can convincingly answer these questions, which is another way of saying that you are in full command of the full toolbox that you should know as an economist, and you can apply it to this question in a way that makes you answer the questions really convincingly. And then also, of course, the job market paper should be representative of the work that you generally work on, because it is showcasing, again, you as an economist. What's really important when selecting a paper to be your job market paper, you should consider the fact that hiring committees generally reward creativity, which means coming up with good ideas, conditional on you being able to answer them well, of course. So that means that the hiring committee wants to see that the job market paper reflects your ability of finding an idea, which means you want to pick your best paper, and ideally, the paper is single-authored. I'm saying ideally because these days, quite often, we see a lot of co-authored job market papers, and in principle, that's fine. What you should avoid is co-authoring papers with somebody who's senior to you, and that counts especially for your advisor. And the reason is simply that a hiring committee may look at this. If you co-author a paper with a very senior economist, and they may say, oh yeah, that's an interesting paper, but probably the senior person had the idea anyway. And that's something you want to avoid, because you want to get the credit for having the idea. So conditional on a certain job market paper quality, you want to, of course, pick the paper with the fewest co-authors that you have. And that's why I'm saying ideally it's single authored. But again, it's a trade-off, right? Like you need to weigh the quality of your paper with the number of co-authors. So essentially, if it's the trade-off between having a really good paper with a few or just one junior co-author versus having a not so great paper, which is single author, then you may want to go for the better paper. But this is a trade-off you can make, and you alone can make. And I think as advice, I would say, go to your advisors, and if they are not helpful, ask other graduate students which papers you should choose. Another tip is if you're still early in the PhD and you're thinking about the market in a few years, then I think the best advice I can give you is to start working on job market paper worthy ideas as early as possible and seek constant feedback along the process to have a paper ready, because having a good job market paper in many cases just takes a lot of time. And once you've settled on a paper, then you want to think about ways, how can I make this more interesting to a broad audience? Because eventually there will be lots of people that you will be presenting your paper in front of. So you want to make sure that everybody can find something interesting about them and that it answers a very broad and fundamental question. And then, of course, you want to make sure that any alternative explanations that somebody can have for why your empirics are not working out the way you claim they do, or why your theory is not covering an aspect that it should, make sure that you have all bases covered and have really a well-rounded paper that answers everything related to your research question. And then what I would also recommend is that if you don't have enough people to talk to about your job market paper, then you may want to approach other people in your field that work on really closely related stuff and ask for input. This sounds, of course, daunting, but if there's somebody who's really closely related in terms of content, then I think it may be worth just approaching them, and most people will be open to meet and chat with you. So how do you want to write the introduction of your job market paper? I'm going to be really brief on this, and it's not going to be with a lot of examples. If you check out the slides that I used at the European Job Market meeting in Milan at the info session, then you'll see that I have a few examples for how to write abstract and introduction sentences. But I would also recommend that you look at the actual job market papers of other people on the market. So at the interview selection stage, so when a committee decides who to interview and who not, they will very likely have read your introduction at most. Some will not have read anything, but it's worth noticing that there are a few departments that actually read more than just the introduction. So we at Tilburg take pride ourselves in exactly doing that, reading the full paper of most of the people that we then consider for interviews, but not everybody will do so. So that's why it's important that, because a lot of the focus will be on the introduction, that you keep it really to about 4 to 6 pages, and that you make sure it's super, super polished. If you have the trade-off spending your time on rewriting the empirical strategy section or the model extension section versus working on the introduction, quite often the answer should be work on the introduction. It needs to be really polished and really smooth. And that may require not rewriting once or twice, but actually dozens or more times. So you should plan enough time before the market kicks off that you have the introduction polished. And get feedback from peers, professors, everyone who owes you a favor. Sometimes even people who are not economists can be of great help giving feedback. And you will see, as you get feedback and then improve the introduction, get feedback, you will see that the comments are becoming less and less useful. And that's how you know that you're nearing a state where your introduction is working out quite well. And the same holds for the abstract. So for the abstract, that's usually between 100 and 200 words, mostly closer to the 100 than the 200. And what's important is that you make the abstract really all about your contribution and your findings. So usually you're going to start with one sentence in which you want to set the stage or motivate your broad research questions, something like, why are some countries rich and others are poor? Or there's been a long-standing interest in why women shy away from competition. So you're really setting the stage for answering, for setting up your precise research question and what you do. So this would usually be 1 or 2 sentences. For example, something like, in a field experiment, I analyze if insurance take-up increases if participants observe the insurance choice of a peer as kind of like a description. Then the one or two most important findings, such as my model shows that media concentration leads to increased revenue of 50%. And then the second half, if you will, which is then only 3, 4, at most 5 sentences, but it's really about the implications of your findings. And the implications mean that you say, why and in what way are your results transforming our knowledge about the topic or the field? Like, which commonly held beliefs may we be changing because you provide first-time evidence on? Or in how far do you improve substantially on the methods and let us see new things that we haven't seen before? So to put it in one sentence, why is what you're doing, why is it earth-shattering? If you have the abstract, then it comes all to writing the job market paper introduction, which usually consists of 4 parts, although parts 2 and 3 are quite often intertwined into one paragraph because it's much better for the reading flow. Part 1 is going to be a motivation about the general topic and why people should care. And then parts 2 and 3 is a presentation of what you do, usually step by step, combined with the findings. And then part 1 is going to take this to the existing literature and interpret what this means. And that's also where I think it's important to mention that you should not, ideally not have a related literature section, but that instead in part 4, you name the most related literature, and then you say how your work improves upon what we already know. Because the introduction and your the part of it that is related literature, if you will, is not about you showing that you know what exists. It is about you demonstrating that you can elevate the knowledge that people already have to a higher level and can improve upon that, and that we can learn something that enhances our knowledge. So let us have a look at part 1 real quick. Part 1 is the motivation of the topic. So it's usually 1 paragraph long, sometimes 2. And the purpose of it is really that you convince the reader that this is an important area of research that you're working on, and that they should be interested in everything you're saying next. It's important to say, don't span a story arch that is too narrow, because then the reader might actually believe that the topic is really too unimportant to have a major academic impact, right? Like, don't say, oh, public goods games with punishment have been shown quite extensively in the literature on how they work, but not as much has shown on how this interacts with another feature. Like, really make it broadly appealing to an audience that they think what you're studying has economic implications that are really far. But on the other hand, if your motivation is too broad, you also risk, of course, that the reader may believe that your study doesn't have external validity, right? If you look at a case study in one country, but you're claiming to show universal effects, then you got to really carefully navigate that. I think it always helps to use numbers to stress the importance. For example, when it comes to gun violence, talk about numbers, or asylum seekers. Like, really, numbers always help people to put things in perspective. So here are 2 examples that I think are helpful, but you can use it in essentially, I think, any context. Some topics that you work on may be important for the scientific community. Others may be important for policy mostly. Just make sure that you mention the importance in either scientific or policy discussions, or ideally both. And then the transition to what you're about to do should be you telling the reader, what's the problem with this literature? Why couldn't they study the question that they could? And what new insights do you bring to the table, right? Didn't they have the data or the right methods or the computational power? Or what is new that allows you to do the next step now? Then parts 2 and part 3 is a very high-level description of what you do in the paper, already coupled with presenting the most important results. That's why I said part 2 and 3 are intertwined. It's usually between 2 and 5 paragraphs, and it's important that you don't discuss unimportant details. It's not important where you downloaded the data set, how you specifically define a control variable, or what technique you use to determine the model equilibrium. It's really about providing a high-level overview. And when you write the paper and you have the meat of your paper, you'll have an idea of what the most important steps are, and you got to bring them back to the introduction and list them there. And the goal is really to give the reader a very basic understanding in like 2 or 3 pages of what you're doing in the job market paper without having to read the rest. And this is the most descriptive and the least persuasive part of your job market paper, if you will. And I'm saying most descriptive and least persuasive because, of course, still your job is to persuade the reader. It's just more relatively seen, more descriptive. And as I said, you can find great examples if you check out the job market papers of candidates from recent years on how to do it. Part 4 is then, as I said, the contribution relative to the existing literature. Ideally, you want to make sure to avoid listing incremental contributions. You want to say, am I really pushing the knowledge frontier with my paper? How am I expanding our knowledge, doing something completely new that is really shifting what we know and is changing our commonly held beliefs? And the typical organization of that is that you have 2 to 4 paragraphs in which you group the related papers. Like, for example, you say, I speak to the literature that is concerned with X. They have commonly found Y. My paper pushes the boundary because it is for the first time able to show this very important mechanism, something like that. So it's really important to not just summarize the literature, but really to share how you contribute to that literature and how you improve upon everything that we know. A few more job market paper tips is always pick an informative title. Please avoid puns in the title. They will not land as well as you may think. Always include a hyperlink at the top that links to the most current version that you have deposited on your website so that somebody can actually have a look at the most current version. Font size 12 is quite commonly used. Some people use font size 11. I would recommend 12 because some older faculty may prefer having a larger font size. Please make sure that whatever you write is not too prosaic. It should be factual, but still persuasive. But it's not a novel. It's a job market paper. And when writing, keep in mind the goal that you want to persuade the reader of the potential and quality of your work, potential in terms of being able to transform what we're doing in the field, making a substantial contribution, etc. So before I move on to CV, I just want to quickly see if there are any questions at any point. So if you have a question, then just unmute yourself and ask it. But we can also have questions later, if you will. No questions yet? Okay, cool. Then let's talk about the CV and what it should contain.
I do have a question about I do have a question about when you write a job market paper, would it be recommended to avoid writing we, even though it's your word, your job market paper usually, but it's commonly used when you write your thesis to say like, well, we, even though it's yours, just, so would you recommend that we write I do and be very, or does that, is
so,
not that relevant, like we or I, is that not really relevant for anything?
I think this is I noticed on Twitter that this seems to be quite a contentious topic, and I think the very general advice is that if your job market paper is single authored, you should write I. You can write we if you write it in the sense that you say, you, the reader, and I together, we now discover the next step. Something like, as we will see when solving for the equilibrium, then you would use that. But otherwise, I think you should use I. But I personally don't have a strong opinion, but my feeling is that some people do and prefer that you use I if it's a single author paper.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, cool. Then moving on to the CV. CVs quite often follow a standard form. Many institutions provide it to their job market candidates. If they don't, then just check out other candidates' websites from some big name institutions and just follow this format. You will see there are lots of commonalities. What you're going to list is your previous education, where you got it, your research output with a short abstract of each paper that you wrote, and the job market paper goes first in that list. Your areas of interest, quite often you would even list those before you list the research output. Any teaching experience you may have, professional experience, only to the extent that it's relevant. Like, nobody wants to know if you worked as a delivery driver at Domino's when you were 15, but if you've done some relevant research experience, then you should list that. Any awards or grants that you've won, the names and contact information of your references, and your own contact information. Please include the phone number, the email address, and your website. All of these are super important. And when it comes to what research output you should list on the CV, please only list output that you're comfortable with talking about, having an intelligent conversation about for at least 5 minutes. Otherwise, don't list it, because this may hurt you if somebody asks you about it and you can't have a good conversation, for example, in an interview. Reference letters, extremely important. So you will need at least 3 letters of recommendations. Some people have 4, and sometimes, but rarely, I see 5 letters of recommendations. My general rule would be beyond 3 letters, you should only add letters if they contain helpful information that is not contained in the other letters. Repetitive letters don't help. I think quite often they also don't hurt. But really, if you think that somebody can add some valuable information, if you add them as a letter writer, then do that. I would recommend having an honest conversation with your letter writers about your preferences and what they can do for you. And what I mean by that is, like, try to get a sense of how strong a letter they are willing to write, if they can help you out with tailoring it towards your preferences. For example, are they willing to reach out to schools where you have applied, and are they willing to kind of like pitch you as a great candidate, which might increase your chances of getting an interview? And yeah, also tell them about geographic constraints that you may have, so that and ask them if they can potentially write a stronger letter if you narrow yourself to specific geographic areas. So yeah, part of this is trying to get an idea of how strong a letter they will write. Ask them also for their experience with writing letters and how that resulted in placements, if you have choices among several letter writers, because you want to have the letter to be written by somebody who knows what they're doing. And if you can choose about several letter writers, ask around who's known to write the most supportive letters. Ask former grad students or your advisors for information on that. And what's important to know is that the language in reference letters is very specific. And if your letter writers don't use the right language, this may disqualify you. To give you an example of what that means, here are 2 statements that are not real, but are in spirit of what I've seen in reference letters. The first one is, X was born to be a researcher. His or her achievements match and exceed those of anyone I have encountered in my 18 years at school Y. And the second one is, X learned very quickly and produced a very nice paper. And you can see that a typical place receives, as Antonio told you last week, receives over 600 applications. And if there's a brief screening process that takes letters of recommendation into account, you can see how the comparison between having one statement versus the other may make a difference for you. So that's why I would recommend that you should always make sure that your letter writers are aware of how to write a good letter, and if not, direct them towards materials that will improve them. For female candidates specifically, be aware that there is apparently substantial gender bias in these letters. And if you feel comfortable with it, you should ask your letter writers if they are aware to make sure that this doesn't happen to you. But of course, this may be a topic that not everybody would want to bring up with their advisor, which I would understand. But it's really important that if you apply selectively, then you tell them so that they can mention this, right? If you say, oh, because of my partner, I'm really bound to staying in France, then your letter writers can say in the letter something like, due to personal circumstances, this person has only applied in France, which may then make French schools who are thinking that you may be too far out of reach for them reconsider you because of the geographic preferences. All right. The next item is the cover letter. And so now we've covered the mandatory part. You've got to have the job market paper. You've got to have the letters of recommendation. You got to have a CV. Now let's move into cover letter area. So I think cover letters are a little bit underrated, especially in Europe. I've heard that especially at top institutions in the US, people don't even look at them, but I think it's very different for Europe, because many European institutions, to the extent that I'm aware, will look for clues in the cover letter that you are particularly interested in joining in them, especially if it's an institution that fears competition from overseas. So what I would recommend, and this holds for everyone, but especially for candidates from US institution, mention any possible ties in terms of country, city, university. Maybe you speak the language, maybe you've been there, maybe you've studied there, maybe you have family nearby, even if it's remote family. Mention this to convince them that you're really interested and willing to move. Ideally, you can name a few faculty members in the department who you want to work with, who work on related topics, because these will likely be the people who screen your application, and they may feel flattered that you want to work with them. So doing that research, of course, may be overkill for all schools that you apply to if you apply broadly. So you might want to do it only for a subsample, but I think this can be really helpful in making schools feel more desirable and maybe therefore consider you more seriously. I feel that faculty quality is very heterogeneous across European departments and even within departments. So if your department is really strong in your area, then you should really emphasize that. And it's really important to say, please keep your cover letter to 1 page if possible, but never ever do more than 1.5 pages. Long cover letters are your enemy, because the longer your cover letter, the less likely it is that institutions will have a detailed look at the cover letter. So you want to make it short and concise and convey the information that's important, namely that you're interested in the place and that you have good reasons to come. And then, of course, you have the usual bits, like a few sentences about the research that you do and your contact information and so on. Teaching and research statements. So the teaching statement is usually about 2 pages long and contains some information regarding your teaching philosophy, which I find is quite often some nice sounding but not very contentful sentences like, I put students first, whatever that means. But then usually it's backed up by evidence of how you have implemented that philosophy effectively. What you could do is, if you have taught in the past, is add a few quotes from student evaluations that you've had and the like. The research statement is about 2 to 3 pages. I think this is usually, unless you apply to places that put a strong emphasis on teaching, in research institutions, the research statement is going to be more important. It's usually 2 to 3 pages long, and you will group essentially your existing papers into broader fields. It's usually 2 fields, or sometimes even just 1, sometimes more, but mostly 2. And then explain how they are connected, and then by that relating to the reader, like what's your broader research agenda? How do the papers that you have produced, how do they fit in to the larger literature? Some universities may not pay much attention, but it goes without saying that some actually may do. And so it's important that you take both of these documents seriously and craft them well, like all the other documents you submit. So other documents, teaching evaluations, I would say only submit them if they are required or if they paint you in a good light. If you have terrible teaching evaluations, then if not required, I would recommend to not send them. Diversity statements I've seen rarely in Europe. It's mostly at schools in California that require it. If you need one, then you should stress how you contribute to diversity, which can either be because you contribute to diversity through innate characteristics because of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on, to the extent that you want to reveal that, or otherwise through actions that you take. Like if you're a white European male person, then it's probably more likely that you will need to phrase that through the actions that you take, like by creating inclusive environments and so on. As I said before, include other papers only if they help strengthen your profile. But this may not often be the case. Employers may sometimes request you to submit more than one paper, then do it. And I'm saying it's rarely the case that it improves your profile because your job market paper is supposed to be your best paper. But of course, if you have another paper that's, for example, revised and resubmitted in a top 5 journal, then by all means, it doesn't hurt to include it. In previous years, we've seen more and more people do a short professional video of the job market spiel and upload that. So please only do that if you can deliver a professional product. Don't do like a cell phone selfie blurry recording in which you do a short description of your job market paper. Make sure that it looks professional. And please only do it once your spiel is perfected and not before, because you don't want your spiel to change and you want to come across as professional. In how far they are really used by hiring committees. I have a hard time saying. I have in the past deliberately avoided watching the videos of the candidates before I interviewed them because I was afraid they were going to say the exact same thing, and then I would be bored because I heard the same literal words before. But other people may find them helpful. So I think if you can deliver a professional product, it certainly doesn't hurt to do it. So the whole package should usually be submitted by end October, mid-November. In the US, quite commonly, the deadline is Thanksgiving, but it's important that you check the job ads because some places may have earlier deadlines than others. Make sure that you adhere to all deadlines. I recommend setting up a Google Sheet that tracks everything so that you know when to submit your files. Have a website with a professional picture, all of your papers in downloadable form to the extent that they are ready, and your CV. Please don't use Dropbox or Google Drive to store documents. Some organizations, especially in industry, do not grant access to those, and you don't want to make it hard for people to download your CV. Also, especially Google Drive, sometimes if you haven't set the options right for giving access, then people will not be able to access your CV directly. And then after that, the next stage is interviews, which is then going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about next week. One last thing that you should be aware of is the possibility to send signal. The American Economic Association allows you to send 2 signals to employers sending specific interest, and you can send that out even if the employer doesn't advertise through the AEA. So that's an opportunity I would use. Ideally, you would send them out to schools that you really like to work for, but you think they would not invite you if you didn't send a signal, but they will invite you if you do. So this could be one of the 2 things. It could be a low-ranked department who thinks that you are out of reach, but you want to convince them otherwise. And I think that's the most common case. It could also be departments who are in doubt if you're good enough for them and makes them have another look at your files. But I think this is much harder to identify than the departments who may be too low ranked, but you may have personal preferences for. Obviously, you don't want to waste the precious signal because you only have 2 on employers that will invite you either way or will not invite you either way. So it's really, you should spend some time thinking about what's the school that might not invite me if I don't send a signal, but that will invite me if I do. And this is all of the content I have for what goes in your package. All of these resources are posted, all of the resources plus also the slides are posted on the Econ Grad Advice website that you can access there. And yes, I think I'm happy to take questions, unless at this stage Antonio already wants to add something to what I've said.
Not really. It was very clear, I think. So let's wait. And there were a few questions that I answered in the chat, but there may be others, and I hope there are others.
Yes. So please just go ahead and unmute yourself, and I think Antonio and I will be happy to answer all of the questions you may have.